Hey, all you respiratory folks, and especially those of you who are taking the NBRC examination. Today I'm going to talk about the PAO2 formula, also called the alveolar air equation. And of course, yes, I promise I'll show you a shortcut so you can get the answer within a few seconds. But here's a secret. That's not what the NBRC is actually going to ask you. Today I'll share with you the secrets of what you really need to know about the PAO2 formula. And frankly, it catches a lot of test takers off guard. So let's crack the code of the PAO2. And just so you know, it's easy. All right, I'm Dennis Stanley with Respiratory Sensei, and today we're looking at the PAO2 formula. Of course, we're going to look at the actual calculation for those of you who are on the exam or preparing for the examination. But we also want to look at what they're really going to ask you on the NBRC exam, what you need to know about the formula so you can get those questions right as well. It turns out that they really don't ask you very often, if at all, to calculate that and spit out a result. So why am I going to show you that? And it's because you have anxiety about it. And so throughout my seminars, when I talk to people and preparing them for the examination, I talk about some things because I know they have anxiety. They're worried that they're going to have a question like that on the exam. And so that may be true of you in calculations and all math on the exam. So I like to just show you different ways to do that math so that if you do get on the exam and you do see that question, you know you have it whipped because it's easy. So we are going to talk about that, but we're also going to talk about what you really need to know for the NBRC examination. So let's first take a look at the actual calculation for the PAO2. And you've probably seen this formula before. Now, if it's been a little while, then it may look a little foreign to you, but that's okay. It's pretty easy. Beside that, we're not going to do this calculation, but just take a peek at it for just a moment. It's got lots of things in it. It's got the barometric pressure, and then you have to subtract the water vapor pressure. Then you kind of times that by the FiO2, which is a decimal formatted calculation. And then after you do all that, you got to subtract the CO2. And before you do that, you have to divide that by the respiratory quotient, which is usually some sort of constant somewhere, but not always. Now, that's a fine formula, and you should probably know about it. But for the purpose of the exam, we're not going to actually do that formula. Instead, we're going to get rid of that formula, and we're going to do this formula. This is a shortcut, and as you look at it more closely, what you'll see is that we're really just going to take the oxygen percentage, not the FiO2. We're going to take the oxygen percent in the percent form. So instead of 0.5 in FiO2, we're just going to call that 50%. And we're going to times that by 7. Now we do have to subtract a little bit. To know what we're going to subtract, we're just going to take the CO2 and add 10 to that, and then we're going to take that away. We'll practice that here in just a moment, but what we want you to remember is that you're going to use the shortcut, and the shortcut's not going to give you an exact answer. That's okay. Turns out the NBRC knows that you're supposed to be estimating the answer. And my question to everybody who's operating in the field, do you think it really matters if your PAO2 is 302 versus 300? And so if you get 300, but the real answer, if you did the whole equation, is 302, do you think that really matters to patient care? And the answer is no. We care if the patient is 200 or 300 or 400, but not 300 or 302 or 299 or 301, any of those numbers. Those are just too close to care about. And so that's why it's okay to estimate the answer and use shortcuts like this. All right, well, let's go to the whiteboard and let's take a look at these calculations and apply the new shortcut that we've just learned. Okay, here we are at the whiteboard. And just to remind you, remember this was the full equation right here, and it has all the components, but we don't want to do this equation. That's the full equation that we're not going to care about anymore. What we're more interested is doing this shortcut right here. So we want to just do those. What you're going to notice is in the shortcut that you don't need all of the numbers, even though the NBRC might give you the barometric pressure, might give you the water vapor pressure and the respiratory quotient. They could give you all that because they don't know what you're actually using to calculate and get the answer. And frankly, they don't care. But think about this. They have to give you all of the information that's contained in the full formula. That's why you're going to have a lot more information than you actually need. When you look at the shortcut here very quickly, what you'll see is that all you really need to know is you need to know the oxygen percentage, and you need to know the CO2. And so when we do practice equations, that's all I really need to give you in order to do that. So let's take a look at some of these practice equations. Okay, so remember, I just need the CO2 and I need the FiO2, and I can do the shortcut for the calculations. And that's what we're going to do right now. Okay, so first thing we'll say is that PaO2, that's what we're calculating, is equal, remember it's got two parts. And the first part is the FiO2, or the oxygen percentage, remember the O2%, times 7. Now in this case, let me just take us back, we're just going to substitute the right answers in there, so we're dealing with 50%. Remember, this is in decimal form, but we want the percent form. So we're going to say 50%, remember we're doing times 7, and that's going to equal 350. All right, so now that we've got that, we now need to do the other part of the calculation, which is the subtraction. And so we have the CO2, which we now know is 40, but we're going to add 10 to that, and then that's going to equal 50. So our calculation really is that the PaO2 is equal to 350 minus 50, or the PaO2 is equal to 300. And so that's really all we needed to do in order to get that. All right, so that's pretty easy, right? All right, well, let's try another one very quickly. All right, remember we're calculating the PaO2, and so the PaO2 is equal to, well, what's the FiO2? 60, but we're going to use it as the percent form times 7, and so that's the first part. But then we also need to subtract the next part. This right here is going to be equal 420. And then the CO2, right, which is, in this case, is going to be 50 plus 10 is equal to 60. So what we're set up with is PaO2 is equal to 420 minus 60. And you can just do this a few times. And what you're going to get is that the PaO2 is going to be equal to 360. Simple enough, right? All right, let's take a peek at this. Now, what's interesting about this next one is that we're using air, or sometimes called room air in the old days. It's going to be called just air on the NBRC exam. And we're using 21. Okay, so let's just start calculating this. So the PaO2 is, first we have to do the oxygen percentage, which is 21%, times 7. And if we do that, we're going to get 147. So there's the first part of it. And then we have to take the CO2. Now the CO2 is 40, we've got to add 10 to that, and that's going to equal to 50. And so the PaO2 is going to equal 147 minus 50, where the PaO2 is going to be equal to 97. All right, so that's how we do those calculations. The best way to practice that is just to make up about 10 sets of FiO2 numbers and PCO2 numbers, and you can just make them up. Now, I wouldn't pick outlandish numbers, but just CO2 is usually 30, 40, 50, something like that. Maybe it's 60. You can even deal with higher CO2s if you like to. And then the FiO2, remember, we're doing anywhere from 21 to 100%. If it was 100%, the decimal form would be 1.0, but you're going to use 100. 100 times 7, and then minus the CO2 plus 10. But it's pretty easy. Do it about 10 times, and you'll have that shortcut probably hardwired into your brain. But on the examination, you might call it the alveolar air equation, or the P big AO2. Now that we know how to calculate that, what we really want to do is look at what is really on the examination. Increasingly rare, I'll never say never, but increasingly rare is that they give you the numbers and ask you for the final number, final PaO2. When that does happen, however, you do have to remember that you're estimating the answer. And so while you might calculate a PaO2 of 300 and you go to the answers, they may have A is at 97 and B is at 194 and then C is at 302 and then 4 is at 412 or D is at 412. So the thing to remember there is that you pick the closest one, and usually the answers are not super close together. And so if I saw an answer of 302 and I saw that I had calculated or estimated about 300, then the answer would be that 302. They know you're estimating the answer. You should be estimating the answer. Talking to an NBRC representative, the question was, does the NBRC know that you're using shortcuts? And the answer is yeah, absolutely. In fact, here's an interesting thing said by somebody in the NBRC. The NBRC doesn't actually give you enough time to do the full calculation. So they know you're using shortcuts. You should be able to use shortcuts because in reality, you should be estimating the answer. So don't let that bother you. But what you more likely will run into on the exam is a couple of these facts that you need to know. The first one is you need to know this fact, that it is impossible for the oxygen level in the artery to be more than the oxygen level in the alveoli. And so let's go to the whiteboard and take a peek as to why that is. Okay, remember what we're asking here, is it possible for the PaO2, in other words, the amount of oxygen that's in the artery, is that possible right here to be greater than what is in the alveoli? And the answer is absolutely not. It is impossible. And let me just show you why. Okay, so let's pretend like we have this alveoli here. And as you know, in the alveoli, we have oxygen that's accumulating there. And so O2 is coming in here. And the PaO2, let's just say the PaO2 is 100. Now, if we look closely, we'll see that there's an artery that's coming right by that alveoli, and it's picking up oxygen. Well, if it's 100 in the alveoli, is it possible for the now we're dealing with a little a, PaO2 to be 102 right here? And the answer is no, because remember, it's trying to borrow money from its friend, the alveoli, and the alveoli only has $100, right? And so can the alveoli get can the artery get $102 out of the alveoli? No, it can't get that. It can get less. It can get $99, and maybe it can get all of it. Not really ever all of it, but because the alveoli wants to keep some of it all the time. But it can get $99, $98, whatever. So it's just the same there. And so that's impossible. Now, why do you need to know that? Because here's how it could present to you on the examination. All right, so let's take a look at this. So let's just pretend that we have this, we have somebody that we're getting a blood gas on. And we get a PaO2 of, let's just say we get 152. And we look at the FiO2 and we find out that they are only on 21%, so they're breathing room air. And of course also on the blood gas, we have a CO2 of about 40. Now, probably if you look at that, you'll be able to realize that right away that 152 sounds bizarre. You've probably never seen somebody sitting there breathing room air with 152 PaO2, so you should suspect that. But we're going to do some math, specifically the alveolar air equation, to prove that that's not possible. The way we can do that is we can calculate, based upon our FiO2 and our CO2, what's the maximum possible PaO2, the oxygen tension, is possible in the alveoli. And then we'll know if the reported value on the ABG is higher than that which is in the alveoli, we know that something's wrong. Let me talk about what's wrong. It's probably the ABG machine. It probably needs to be recalibrated, but it could also just be your sample. You maybe have an air bubble in there, maybe it's over heparinized, who knows? But the answer, while that's the interpretation, the answer or the intervention is to redo the blood gas. Or it might be to use a different blood gas machine, or it might be to calibrate that machine because something is wrong. But let's just take a look and prove with the alveolar air equation why 152 would not be possible. So what we want to do is we want to do a quick little calculation. And remember, we're dealing with 21% oxygen, and we know the CO2 is 40, so we're going to set up our shortcut. We know we're going to go 21% times 7, and we know that's going to equal 147. Right off the bat, we're in trouble because the PO2 in the artery is showing 152, and that's not possible. But let's continue. And then, of course, the CO2 is 40. We're going to add 10 to that, and that's going to equal 50. And now the PaO2, the pressure in the alveoli, is 147 minus 50. And so the PaO2, the maximum PO2, could only be 97. Well, take a look at this. We have a problem. And we have in the alveoli, it's 97, but when we do the blood gas, it's 152. This is not possible. And so you know you have an error in your blood gas. Now, just for fun, let's up the numbers a little bit, because when the numbers get big, that's when you kind of go, I don't know if that's possible or not. All right, so let's just do this again. All right, bear with us. Okay, so here we have, let's just say we have an FiO2, we'll say 60% here. All right, it's a bigger number, isn't it? We'll still say the CO2 is 40. We could make it 40, 50, whatever. But the blood gas, so the PaO2, is showing to be 320. Now that's an awful lot of oxygen in the artery. So we're wondering, wait a minute, is that even possible? So we need to do the PaO2 calculation to see if the 𝑃𝑎O2 can be more than 320. If it can't be, then we know that's impossible. So let's just do the math. Well, we're going to take, let me just change my pen here. We're going to take 60 times 7, right? Because that's what our FiO2 is. It's going to be in a decimal form. We're going to switch it to a percent times 7. And right there we have 420. Okay, that's pretty high, isn't it? Our PaO2 in our artery is 320. So that's less than 420. We still need to subtract the CO2 to prove this. But the CO2 is 40 plus 10, so that's equal to 50. And so we have to take away 50 there. And what we're going to get is 370. So we have a PO2 of 370. And the question is that larger than the PO2 on the blood gas? And so 370 is in fact greater than 320, and so it is possible. So you looked at that and thought, 320, that's an awful big PaO2. I wonder if there's a problem in the blood gas machine or my sample, and do I need to redo this blood gas? Or do I need to calibrate the machine? And the answer is no, it is possible for the actual PaO2 or the oxygen in the artery to be 320, because in the alveoli it could be 370, and that's higher. All right, so that's one secret of the NBRC exam in terms of what they might actually ask you about the PaO2. Notice we might have still had to do the calculation a little bit. They didn't ask us for the values, but they wanted us to use that formula to see if an ABG PaO2 value, an arterial oxygen value, was even possible. They want you to understand that so you can find that there's a problem in the reported ABG in the first place, and you can make corrections. The other thing they'd like you to know is that when they look at the components of the alveolar air equation, they would like to know if something increased or decreased, what would it do to the PaO2? So they're looking for your understanding in the trend of the PaO2. Well, if you don't know, if you can't get your head around it, if I said, hey, if the CO2 was increasing but the PaO2 was staying the same, then what would happen to the alveolar oxygen tension if the CO2 went up? And you might be able to reason that out quite easily in your head, but you don't have to. Let's go to the whiteboard and we're going to look at the calculation that will help us to do that. Okay, so here we are on the whiteboard, and we can just make up numbers here. But let's pretend like we have 50% or an FiO2 of 0.5, right? 0.5. And then we'll just say we have a CO2 of 40, and that'll be one case. All right, but then let's raise the CO2. If that's the question, what happens to the PaO2 if the CO2 goes up? And it doesn't matter. You can make up the numbers, but you just got to make the CO2 go up. And so we're still going to use the FiO2 of 0.5, but this time we're going to make the PCO2 go to 50. So let's just do the two PaO2 shortcuts and we'll figure that out. All right, and so let's bring that up. All right, so first of all, we're going to go 50%, right, times 7, which is going to equal to 350. And then we got to subtract the CO2, but we got to add 10 to it first. So that's going to be 50. So the PaO2 in this case is going to be 300. Now let's slide over to the right where we have the increased CO2 value that we made up. It doesn't matter what it is, it's just that the question was asking us, what happens if the CO2 is rising? So we made it rise. Instead of CO2 of 40, we're going to use a CO2 of 50. All right, so the first part of that is still the same. We're going to go 50, and this is the 50%, right? Times 7 is still equal to 350. But the CO2 is now 50. We've got to add 10 to that, and that's going to be 60. And then the PaO2 is equal to 350 minus the 60. In other words, the PaO2 is going to equal to 290. So if I were to ask the question, what happens if the CO2 rises? In this case, we just picked an arbitrary number. We went from a CO2 to 40 to a CO2 to 50. And what happened to the PaO2, or the alveolar oxygen tension? And it went down. And so the answer would be it would affect a decrease. On the exam, they'd say an increase, a decrease, or they'd say it kept it the same, no change, or they might even say impossible to tell given the current information. So those are usually their common possibilities there. But you can do the calculation in the shortcut version and swap out any of those numbers to see what would happen. So in other words, what would happen to the PO2 if you continually were raising the FiO2? You could do the calculation, a couple calculations to raise the FiO2 and see what happens to the resulting PaO2. And a lot of times, if you do that a few times in advance of your test, you'll get a sense of what's going to happen anyway. But if you're on the exam, you have the shortcut, you can quickly calculate it and you can see what's going to happen to the PaO2 given any change in that formula. Well, that's what's really probably going to happen on the examination to you. You're probably not going to have to calculate the PaO2 and give them a value. I never say never because questions come and go, and so you're going to be prepared for that by using the shortcut. But the NBRC is more interested that you understand what this infers. First, they understand that they want to understand that you know that if the PaO2 in the artery is reported to you and it's excessively high, you know how to prove that that's impossible or it is possible. And that you also know how to intervene by doing another blood gas, maybe calibrating the machine, tagging the ABG machine down because it doesn't look like it's operating correctly. And then, of course, they want to know what happens to the trend. Think about that for a minute. They know you understand the formula if they can say if the CO2 is rising, what would happen to the PaO2? If you can get that answer correct, then they know you understand more of the PaO2 in concept. And that's what they're interested in that. So there's just a couple of secrets and a couple of changes that have happened on the NBRC exam over the years that I've been seeing the exam and even taking the exam. All right, so I hope that's helpful. We'll look forward to doing more formulas. And I'm Dennis from Respiratory Sensei, and we'll see you around.
Looking to earn AARC CEUs while making a difference? 𝗷𝗵𝗃 is the site where education meets impact. We offer a free CE course each month to help you advance your professional knowledge. And with a small donation of only $34, you'll become an annual member and receive unlimited access to all our CE courses. Your donations will go towards providing study materials for the first RTs in Africa. So check it out and make a meaningful difference while advancing your career. 𝗘𝗵𝗶𝗀𝗄